In a world where the news for wildlife is rarely good, as a result of everything from modern agricultural practices to global warming, 21st century life seems to have become more and more distanced from the natural order of things. For urban dwellers in particular, this is a great pity. However, there are creatures that can be found day in, day out, even in the most built-up areas of Great Britain, that we can all still enjoy. We are, of course, talking about birds, and with just a small amount of effort on our part, our feathered friends can enrich our lives beyond our wildest dreams, connecting us with nature in the most tangible and delightful way. And if the increasing popularity of birdwatching is anything to go by, we are all catching on to the benefits of this rewarding and relaxing pastime, which teaches us to treasure the wildlife on our own doorsteps. Whether for the young or the young at heart, scattering crumbs for the birds is as natural and easy as drawing breath. And with a wonderful variety of species ready and willing to take our offerings, it's not difficult to see why birdwatching is such a joy. The first programme in this series looked at the pleasure given to us by everyday garden birds. But as we move on to Birds to Treasure, there'll be the opportunity to cast our gaze slightly further afield. This rich visual collection will give you a more in-depth view of bird watching, and although you're not expected to become a fully fledged twitcher, your interest in birds is guaranteed to develop from that of having a casual interest to wanting to learn a great deal more. From everyday birds like the familiar red-breasted robin to the tuneful chaffinch and the boisterous blue tit, discover how to also attract the more elusive species to the safe havens of our gardens, like the beautiful jay and the truly fascinating greater spotted woodpecker. Also, we'll look out for the shyer species belonging to the well-known bird families, such as the gregarious and noisy long-tailed tit and the colourful but now rarely seen bullfinch. Birdwatching has become a much cherished pastime for many people, and putting energy and effort into creating a space that'll attract the birds is always time well spent. As well as enjoying the tasty treats on your bird table and contained in your feeders, offering a constant supply of fresh clean water in a safe and accessible bird bath will definitely improve your chances of seeing a wider variety of species all year round. It's equally important to understand that sometimes species that in the past were very common have in recent years gone into a surprising decline. A prime example is the starling, which the RSPB now categorise as being of red status, meaning it's endangered. Although you're still likely to see starlings in your garden, and even in Britain's towns and cities, their numbers have decreased so dramatically they're being carefully monitored. The RSPB in fact have two other categories that they use, giving birds green or amber status. Thanks to their efforts, many species are on the green list, meaning that they're thriving, while those being watched with amber status are often prevented from facing a further threat of decline as a result of timely intervention. It's interesting to note that birdwatchers provide the RSPB with a wealth of detailed, accurate information from their records of species they've seen. So not only is this an incredibly pleasurable pastime, it's also extremely useful as well. Ornithology, the study of birds, will open up an incredible resource for us as birdwatchers, helping us to understand our feathered friends and their fascinating behaviour. Developing an interest in natural history, just like the early scientists did, will certainly help your observational skills when it comes to spotting the differences between the various species. On an ongoing basis, you'll soon find yourself noticing such details as the white flash on the wings of a chaffinch, as well as its distinctive pink breast, and the purple and blue sheen on the black and white magpie. It'll take time though, which is hardly surprising, considering that some species were not actually categorised until the late 19th century. It was 1897 before two German ornithologists discovered that the marsh tit and the willow tit were not actually one and the same. So just remember that practice makes perfect, and if you don't always get it right, you're in pretty good company. Identifying birds that look similar will always be a rewarding achievement. Spotting the differences between birds that are not necessarily a part of the same bird family, but have a similar plumage and characteristics, will be just as satisfying. This is certainly true of the wren, dunnock and house sparrow, three very similar looking species, but all from different families that can be rather confusing when it comes to identification because of their size, plumage and eating habits. Starting with the wren, this is a tiny but round brown bird with a fine bill, long legs and toes. It has a short, narrow tail, which is sometimes cocked up at a very jaunty angle. Despite its diminutive size, the wren can be surprisingly loud with its calls and song, particularly during the mating season. If you want to encourage wrens to visit your garden, a scattering of grated cheese at ground level under the shelter of hedges or bushes is always worth a try. And if there are any in your area, this will help to attract them. The wren was once a familiar sight for British shoppers up until the 1960s, when it could be found on a farthing coin. And as you can see, even depicted on a coin, this bird is absolutely delightful. Now we all know that wrens are shy birds that we rarely see, but they do actually have a green status with the RSPB, unlike the house sparrow, which is of similar shape and colouring. It's hard to believe that the house sparrow, known for being one of the most common birds in Britain, has in recent years been suffering a major decline in numbers. This little brown bird has always enjoyed living in close association with man, but this very proximity seems to be causing the problem. Predominantly, it's the city-dwelling sparrow populations that are suffering the greatest losses, and pollution could very well be to blame. But fortunately, they are prolific breeders, and hopefully with the RSPB monitoring their progress, house sparrow numbers will be on the increase. The last of our three similar species, the dunnock, is actually sometimes known as the hedge sparrow, and it can be quite difficult to distinguish from other small brown birds. Although the colouring is very similar to that of a house sparrow, it'll always have a much finer bill. A close-up view will reveal the adult birds showing a striking rich red brick-coloured plumage, but at a distance, the constant fidgeting movements of this bird's wings can be a more obvious and reliable method of identification. Dunnocks are very definitely home birds, rarely flying beyond the safe boundaries of their own territory. But if they happen to be in your area, these truly are birds to treasure. Being able to identify birds from the shape of their beaks can be very useful, and when it came to evolution, proved to be key to our understanding of the origin of the species. Back in the early 19th century, the predominant belief was that God created the earth and all living creatures in 7 days, until the naturalist Charles Darwin put forward his theory of natural selection. After travelling on a scientific expedition aboard the Beagle, which investigated the wildlife on the South American Galapagos Islands, it was the finches that attracted Darwin's attention. The finches on each island all had slightly different shaped beaks, which had developed down through the generations, so that the birds could feed on the foods indigenous to their particular island. It was more than a century later when the discovery of DNA and the true nature of genetic material properly explained this phenomenon, but there's no doubt that the finches really did change the course of history. This information is really helpful for the bird watcher, as if you see a species with a hooked beak, it's quite likely to be a bird of prey, needing to tear flesh, as in the case of the kestrel and the buzzard. By comparison, the fine bill of the dunnock we've been looking at is perfectly adapted for a diet of seeds. Natural history leads us, just as it did the early scientists, towards an observational method of study, and watching the behaviour of the birds, even in your own back garden, will really improve your knowledge of them over time, as well, of course, as giving you hours and hours of pleasure. To encourage as many bird species as possible as your understanding of these delightful creatures increases, you'll want to work on creating as natural a habitat as possible. Putting up feeders and bird tables will be greatly beneficial. But if you want to attract rarer visitors, like the unmistakable bullfinch and the freckle-breasted song thrush, it'll pay to get a little more imaginative. It doesn't matter how big or small your garden is, there'll always be ways to create a bird-friendly environment that'll really encourage wildlife. Keeping grass long in an area of the garden is an easy way to start, as this will encourage more insects than if all your lawn is short, and in turn this will definitely up your attraction rate with the birds, as wherever there are insects, your feathered friends won't be far behind. As you become a more experienced bird watcher, you may well have noticed a pattern of specific feeding times. For example, the blackbird tends to make a concentrated effort to find worms in the morning, while the coal-tit can often be found feasting on sunflower seeds at dusk. So, putting out the right amount and types of food at different times during the day is worth trying when you happen to be at home. Also, try to think about putting foods out at different levels and positions around the garden, as the songbirds will prefer to feed at ground level, while a more confident visitor like the jackdaw will be more than happy to raid your bird table. Jackdaws are fascinating to watch, and although as members of the crow family are perhaps considered not quite so attractive as some of the more delicate species you'll see, their bright-eyed intelligence, particularly when it comes to finding an opportune meal, has to be admired. Even so, many bird species will be cautious about trusting your garden and can take up to a week to begin taking food from new feeders and tables. But if you're patient, the rewards can be quite surprising, particularly if you live near woodland. What you're actually looking at here is a greater spotted woodpecker. And although we often imagine woodpeckers to be rather rare, if you live in an area where there are trees around or close by, you might be pleasantly surprised. Males and females are very similar, but they can be distinguished as only the male has a vibrant crimson flash at the nape of the neck. A juvenile has a red crown patch, which disappears upon reaching maturity. Often, a greater spotted woodpecker is heard before it's ever seen, producing a drumming sound by pecking repeatedly against a tree trunk. This bird actually has a green status with the RSPB, but the lesser spotted woodpecker is on the red list, and you'll need to travel further afield to see them. The lesser spotted woodpecker is the smallest and least common of the 3 UK-based woodpeckers. The male of this species is distinguished from his mate by his bright red crown, and the best time to see these active little birds will be in the warmer days of springtime, before there are too many leaves on the trees. Woodpeckers, as you might imagine, get their name from pecking at tree trunks in search of food. However, the last of the 3 British species, the green woodpecker, spends much of its time feeding on ants on the ground. This is a very shy and wary creature, with a slight squat-looking body, short tail and long bill. It has a bright green rump and red on the top of its head. The male also has a red moustache, whereas the female's moustache is black, and this is at least one way of distinguishing between the 2 sexes. When in flight, the green woodpecker appears to dip and bob, and if you go walking in the woods where they're resident, you might just catch a glimpse of this cautious bird as it flies away. As you get more accomplished with your bird watching, you'll quickly realise that many of the common names for birds have been given because of their behaviour, colouring, or even the sounds that they make. The cuckoo is a prime example of this, named after the call of the male, which is basically cuckoo. Ironically, most of us will have heard a cuckoo, but it is far less likely that you'll have ever seen one. This species has a blue-grey head, upper parts and chest with dark barred white underparts, and is comparable in size to a dove. It has a sleek body, long tail and pointed wings, and both sexes look very similar. The cuckoo arrives in late March or April, when the female will lay her eggs in the nest of other birds, like the smaller dunnock or the shy reed warbler. She'll then set off for warmer climes in July or August, leaving her chicks in the nest, relying on the foster birds to rear them. Few people realise that it was actually the great Dr. Edward Jenner, more famous for discovering a vaccine to eliminate smallpox, who was responsible for documenting the antisocial behaviour of the cuckoo way back in the late 18th century. It had been believed that the adult cuckoo pushed the eggs of the host bird out of the nest, but Jenner, through careful observation, discovered that it was the baby cuckoo responsible for destroying its rivals. He found that the baby cuckoo hatched with a depression in its back, which disappeared after 12 days of life, by when the dirty deed would have been done. By lifting and pushing either the eggs or the other chicks, it was possible to force them out of the nest, as nature at its most cruel ensures the survival of this unique bird. The sight of tiny bird parents feeding the great big cuckoo baby is almost comical, and it's incredible that they don't actually recognise that their ever-hungry offspring is not their own. As soon as the cuckoo is strong enough, it'll migrate, following its real parents to fly non-stop to South Africa, an incredible journey for what is without doubt an incredible species. The migration of birds is a regular seasonal journey that occurs every year. Many bird species migrate due to changes in food availability, habitat, and weather. Migrating birds have excellent navigational skills, and flying to warmer climates gives the birds greater opportunities and longer days for successful breeding and finding food. There are nonetheless dangers that can arise for migrating birds, such as bad weather, hungry predators, exhaustion, and starvation. So doing all you can to help these species build up their strength for the journey will be of immense value. A ready supply of food on your garden bird table will certainly play its part through the summer, so don't imagine that your offerings are only of value through the winter months. And talking of summer visitors, perhaps one best known in Britain is the elegant swallow, which is a distinctly fair weather visitor, departing each autumn to winter as far away as South Africa, often completing a 12,000-mile round trip before the next spring. The swallow's navigational skills are so precise it's able to return to the same nesting site year after year. With its sculptured appearance, this bird is geared for flight, and its beautifully streamlined tail will separate it from the similarly shaped house martin. To distinguish a house martin from the swallow, all you need to look at is the tail. With a conspicuous white rump and a much shorter forked tail than the swallow, identification, although tricky, is straightforward. The house martin also nests differently, choosing exterior locations such as under the eaves of a house, while the swallow will prefer an interior construction. The sight of the house martin in spring, as it returns from wintering in the warmer climes of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, is always a welcome indication that summer is on its way. But there are still many birds to enjoy all year round. So, without further ado, it's time to take a closer look at the great British species that really are birds to treasure. When most people think of the tit family, it's usually the colourful blue tit or the boisterous great tit that'll first spring to mind. But when it comes to birds to treasure, the long-tailed tit is well worth looking out for. This adorable bird can be harder to attract to your garden than other members of the tit family, as they're usually found in woodland or hedgerows. Even so, putting out live offerings may well do the trick, as mealworms will always be popular, and hanging up fat balls in the winter will be equally welcome. They are tiny creatures at just under 6 inches, and that includes their tail, which is way longer than their bodies. The underbelly, which is predominantly white with pink spots, contrasts with black and white upper parts, making this a beautiful little bird that's surprisingly noisy. In fact, their twittering song and shrill call will always get the long-tailed tits noticed, especially as if you see one, there are usually others not far away. Similarly, the marsh tit is likely to be heard before it's seen. It is a neat, clean-looking bird with a well-defined black bib and glossy black cap. It feeds acrobatically and is known to hoard food, similarly to the coal tit, if it finds a good supply, so keep this in mind when topping up your seed feeders. If you find your supply is going down rather quickly, it may be that you're attracting these little creatures, which is a great achievement, as they are on the RSPB's red status list. The marsh tit will be an all-year-round bird, like other members of the tit family, so keeping your food supply plentiful will be very much appreciated. It may surprise you to discover that the starling is another species on the RSPB's red status list, but you're still likely to see plenty of these delightful birds, especially as the summer draws to a close, with many arriving from overseas during the autumn months to winter in Britain. Although it's quite common for this species to be confused with the blackbird, the starling is actually smaller, and despite looking black from a distance, if you get closer without scaring it off, you'll see they're very glossy with a sheen of incandescent purple and green amongst their dark feathers. Another colourful species that you're more likely to see out and about in the autumn is the pheasant. The males have rich chestnut, golden brown and black markings on their body and tail, and with a dark green head and red face, they're very striking indeed. But the female of the species is much less conspicuous, with her paler, brown, rather dull plumage. Although more commonly spotted out in fields or in woodland, they'll visit country gardens, especially if you scatter food offerings across the grass or at a low level. Don't be surprised if you see one male with a number of females. The females will only have the one mate, but the male has in effect a small harem. Watching birds in your own back garden is a wonderful experience, and creating as natural a habitat as possible for them to visit will without doubt bring its own rewards. Nevertheless, no matter how many beautiful birds land on your feeders, it's equally rewarding to get out into the countryside to see them in the wild. You never know, seeing the behaviour of these birds as nature intended could well give you some ideas on how to improve the safe haven your garden provides. Woodland walks are an absolute delight where you'll undoubtedly get to observe some spectacular species, like the colourful jay and the distinctive bullfinch. The scenic and peaceful wander amongst the trees is an all-year-round pleasure, whether strolling through the daffodils and bluebells of spring, or enjoying the vivid orange hues of autumn. And as the colours of the year change, so will the species of bird that you'll not only see, but also hear. On your walk, don't just keep your eyes peeled. Listen out for the songs of the birds. One bird that has a beautiful song ringing out high from the treetops is the aptly named song thrush. This delightful bird is a familiar and popular visitor to our gardens, as well as woodlands and hedgerows. And if you're lucky enough to have shrubs or trees surrounding your garden, It's also worth looking out for the nests of this tuneful bird. This'll be a well-structured construction built entirely by the female, with twigs, grass and moss. The mating season begins early March. There can be up to 3 broods before the end of the summer. Even though the song thrush can be seen all year round, they're very sensitive to harsh winters and have been known to head south in severe weather. Also be sure to look out for the largest resident British thrush, the missel thrush, with its distinctive white underparts speckled with dark spots. In rural communities, the ancient name stormcock is still sometimes used for the missel thrush, because during storms and bad weather, it can often be heard singing out loudly from the treetops. It also has a very distinctive alarm call, which sounds just like a football supporter's rattle. Nesting can start as early as February, and once breeding is complete, missel thrushes become a familiar sight, particularly in the countryside, and as autumn berry crops become available, large family groups will gather to enjoy the rich pickings. Lovely as the thrushes are, there are few birds that you'll spot out walking as beautiful as the jay. A member of the crow family, this bird has prominent blue wings and pinkish-brown plumage, making it surprisingly colourful. But its very shy nature does mean you'll only catch a glimpse of a jay as it flies away. You'll stand more of a chance of seeing jays during autumn months, when acorns are in season, their favourite food. They collect them up, fitting as many as they can in their neck pouches before flying off to store them for the winter. And if you do get them visiting your garden, you can consider yourself very lucky indeed. Another colourful species that you may spot out and about is the bullfinch, another all-year-round resident, but perhaps the wariest of all the finches when it comes to contact with humans. The male is unmistakable, with his bright pinkish-red breast, black cap and tail, and stylish grey back. You'll also spot a flash of bright white visible on this bird's rump when in flight, while the female is less colourful than her mate, with a brown back and duller pink underparts. In the spring, the bullfinch is quite capable of decimating buds on fruit trees and has been known to attack garden shrubs to similarly devastating effect. And historically, they were often shot for causing such damage, which does perhaps explain this bird's aversion to humans. Today, though, with the red status protection of the RSPB, this bird has nothing to fear. Sightings are highly prized by birdwatchers all over the country. Another much prized sighting will be that of the pied wagtail, a delightful small but sprightly character with a distinctive black and white plumage. As the name suggests, this bird's tail is constantly wagging up and down, and it'll always appear to be on the move, dashing about lawns or even car parks in search of food. Insects are very popular with this species, but well-stocked garden feeding stations may well entice this bird into view. Along with the pied wagtail, you may also spot its relation, the grey wagtail, They too constantly wag their tails, but you'll quickly spot the different colouring, as this bird has grey upper parts and a very distinctive flash of lemon yellow underneath its tail. Science has yet to explain why these birds actually wag their tails, although it's been suggested that the wagging disturbs the insects around these fascinating creatures, which can then be easily snapped up, while others believe that it emulates the to and fro movements of water, as wagtails will often be found at the water's edge. The grey wagtail is a very rare garden visitor, as they prefer to nest in fields and damp grasslands, and is more likely to be spotted drinking or bathing in a stream. This pretty bird can, however, be attracted to garden ponds and water features, especially as they prefer to nest in damper areas. So keep this in mind if you're wanting to see this beautiful bird outside your windows. And you never know, you might even be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the young being fed in their nest. An alternative to a woodland walk is visiting a wetland sanctuary, where you can also enjoy beautiful views of the countryside while looking out for bird species nesting at the water's edge, like the great crested grebe, or those that glide over the surface, like the magnificent mute swan. Mute swans are considered to be the loveliest members of the swan family, and in the Middle Ages this beautiful white bird was regularly traded as a prized commodity between noblemen. Interestingly, the legacy of this tradition continues, as the Queen has a prerogative over all swans in England and Wales. Incredibly, despite its elegant appearance, the mute swan is actually one of the heaviest of all flying birds, with the male being larger than the female. It has a long neck with a black and orange beak, and although these swans can become quite tame, they'll get very aggressive over their territory, especially when they're nesting. It's at this point you can be sure it's a mute swan rather than any other species that you're looking at, as it will arch its wings angrily over its back and is the only swan that does this. Despite the name, this swan isn't mute. It's just a lot quieter than other swans like the Buick, Whooper and Trumpeter. But ancient folklore always had it that this swan was silent until moments before it died, when it would sing out a beautiful song. And you do only have to look at these delightful creatures to understand why they've been the inspiration for so many romantic tales and notions. Another glorious water bird to look out for is the Canada goose. This is a sizable species with a distinctive black head and long swan-like neck with a large white throat patch. Originally from North America, this species has successfully spread itself across most of the UK, and it's highly likely that you'll see this noisy, boisterous but charming goose while you're out enjoying a wander around the park or feeding the ducks at the local pond. It's hard to believe, with so many of these birds now common in the UK, that through the 20th century they went into a decline that took them close to extinction. Fortunately, since the 1960s, efforts to conserve the birds and their wetland habitats have been successful, and this species, along with many other waterfowl, are thriving. Another bird that faced extinction rather earlier than the Canada goose was the great crested grebe, because its beautiful head plumes were much sought after by Victorian ladies for their hats. Thankfully, these lovely birds are no longer in danger. Fashions have changed, and the great crested grebe is now safe from persecution of any kind. This is a bird that's well worth looking out for during the mating season, as they have an incredible ritual that they perform. With synchronized dives, they emerge holding weeds from the depths in their beaks, which they follow with an amazing courtship dance. Like other members of the grebe family, the great crested variety nests at the water's edge, where 2 eggs are usually laid, and once the chicks hatch, they can be seen being carried around on their parents' backs. The chicks are fluffy with a black and white striped head, but they lose these markings when they become adults. They do look a little clumsy when they walk on land, but this magnificent creature is without doubt at its loveliest when swimming or diving. Many of the birds we've been looking at have struggled for survival for any number of reasons, but some of the smaller species actually find themselves facing danger from the larger birds. Now, of course, this is distressing, particularly when it happens in your garden, but a magpie taking a songbird chick is simply an example of nature at work as part of the food chain. In fact, some of our most fascinating birds are carnivores, and we'll now take a closer look at a few of our best-loved birds of prey. This splendid creature is a buzzard, the most common British bird of prey and a beautiful sight to see. Whether out in the open countryside or in sheltered woodland, the buzzard is equally at home and can be spotted regularly, perching on tree branches, telegraph poles, and even, on occasion, roadside fence posts. The buzzard has a similar look to that of the golden eagle. However, as the golden eagle is incredibly rare, there's little likelihood of you making a misidentification. Basically, if you can see the bird, it'll be a buzzard. You'd have to go to a great deal of effort to see a golden eagle. With its broad, rounded wings and mottled colouring, ranging from dark to pale brown, this bird soars through the air, flying and hovering when stalking its prey. The buzzard's diet mainly consists of rabbits and small birds, as well as insects and worms when the weather turns stormy. Another very familiar bird of prey that you may see soaring through the air or perched on a tree branch is the smaller but equally beautiful kestrel. It's easily distinguished when it's hunting, either hovering seemingly at a great height or swooping down like an arrow to seize its prey. Unfortunately, of late, kestrel numbers have been in decline, due in part to modern agricultural practices, and this is being watched with care by the RSPB, who've given the kestrel an amber status. However, kestrels do adapt to change very well, especially where that change is man-made, even taking advantage of buildings where they're known to nest, as well as in those made by other birds, because the kestrel will never build a nest of its own. And kestrels aren't the only birds that don't make their own nests. Owls will also use the nests of other birds, or man-made nest boxes that are put up on isolated farmland trees or at the edge of woodland. Seeing an owl is a great privilege, but sadly an all too rare pleasure, despite the fact that many of us will have heard the characteristic twit-to-woo call of the tawny owl on a moonlit night. There have always been superstitions connected with birds, many of which are related to the most ancient of beliefs. Stories have been told of birds bringing bad or good luck to our lives. An example being the magpie, which is meant to bring you sorrow if you see one, while according to the rhyme, two will bring you joy. And when it comes to owls, although William Wordsworth used the barn owl as the bird of doom in his poetry, there are many who perceive the owl as a symbol of great wisdom, and in Greek mythology it is the little owl that's considered to be so wise. The little owl, as its name indicates, is the smallest owl at only 23 centimetres in height, and wasn't actually introduced to Britain until the 19th century. Interestingly, this is one of the few owls that can be seen during the day, usually perched on a tree branch or even on a ledge of an old farm building. But if you get too close, you'll certainly be able to tell if this beautiful creature becomes alarmed, as it'll bob its head up and down very distinctively. And if you wanted to see the owl responsible for that most recognisable of calls, this is a tawny, famous for its to-wit-to-woo. However, it may come as a surprise that these sounds are not made by a single owl. The to-wit part is actually a contact call, while the to-woo is a male territorial call. So if you hear both, it'll be a male answering a female or another male. This delightful owl is about the size of a pigeon and has a reddish-brown rounded body and head, with a ring of dark feathers around its face, surrounding the dark eyes. Owls in general have magnificent eyes with binocular vision to help them judge distance. They also have very sensitive ears to hear and locate the slightest rustle, and the barn owl, for instance, can locate its prey just by listening in the pitch black of the night. This bird's flight feathers also help when creeping up on unsuspecting smaller animals, as the edges of the feathers break up the flow of air over its wings, making the barn owl totally silent in flight. This owl, with its heart-shaped face, buff back and wings, is truly lovely, but sadly this species is slowly declining and is on the RSPB's amber listing. So to see one in this close-up detail, we've had to come to a bird of prey rescue centre. There are in fact owl sanctuaries and raptor centres all over the country, where these magnificent birds are cared for when they've been injured, which can often be as a result of road traffic accidents. And the best news of all is the fact that you can visit these centres, where you can learn more about the owl species and also be advised of how you can best help if you do happen to come across an injured bird while out and about in the countryside. What you see here is a baby tawny owl being checked over. He was found on his own, with no parents in sight. The people who found him did the right thing in bringing him to the rescue centre, as he was very weak, and baby owls actually stay with their parents for quite some time, as learning to fend for themselves is a lengthy process. This extremely fortunate owl will now be cared for and rehabilitated so that he can be returned to the wild as soon as possible. This rescue centre is a great place to see more unusual owls as well, and this delightful creature is a long-eared owl. Again, you'll quickly work out why this owl is so named, as it has tufts that look distinctly ear-like on the top of its head. Interestingly, these tufts are not actually ears at all, but feathers, but you'd have to get very close to work that out. Unlike many bird species, the female is larger than the male and is also darker, although both have feathers that are brown and vertically streaked. The colour of their eyes varies according to where they come from, with those found in Britain being orange, while their North American counterparts have yellowish golden brown eyes. For anyone who takes up bird watching, as time goes on, there'll be more and more species appearing on your list of birds to treasure. In fact, wherever you go, you'll often find yourself packing your bird identification guide, notebook and binoculars, and a holiday at a seaside location will provide you with a host of different species to look out for. In our towns and cities, seagulls can actually become quite a problem, especially if they become aggressive. But their unmistakable cries will forever be synonymous with the seaside. If you get a chance to just sit on a beach and watch their antics, you'll be entertained for some considerable time. But there are many seabirds that definitely fit into the treasure category, and the shag is without doubt a prime candidate. This goose-sized bird has a long dark neck which is quite similar to that of a cormorant. With a thin beak and a characteristic steep forehead, during the breeding season the adults will develop a dark glossy green plumage and prominent curved crest on the front of their head. They'll nest along the coast and feed on fish, which they generally catch as they come back up to the surface after a precision dive. Sadly though, just like every seaside holiday, our time enjoying these wonderful and most treasured birds has come to an end. Hopefully, you'll now be inspired to work on increasing the number of species you attract to your own garden. And if you think about creating a wildlife-friendly habitat, you may be very pleasantly surprised as who comes to visit. And of course, don't forget to try putting out different kinds of food for the birds, with black sunflower and tiny Niger seeds being the experienced bird watcher's all-time favourites. They may be slightly more expensive than more general bird food, but as all manner of species are very partial indeed to these tasty treats, as your interest in bird watching develops, it's well worth the investment, especially as their high calorific value will also be of great benefit to the birds during the colder winter months. In fact, there can be no better way to treasure our British birds than to care for and protect them, while they give us a whole lifetime of pleasure and delight.